Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex and I'm your host for today's episode. Episode 30, the last episode in our Charles Manson series. Picture this. It's November 8th, 1972. A hiker is walking through the peaceful wooded area near Guerneville, California. A quiet Russian River resort community where people come to escape the chaos of city life. The morning air is crisp, leaves crunching underfoot. But then something catches his eye that will haunt him forever. A human hand protruding from the earth like a grotesque plea for help. What that hiker discovered that day would unravel a web of murder, betrayal, and revenge that stretched back to one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. And at the center of it all, the lingering shadow of Charles Manson and his deadly family. When police arrived at that wooded area near Guerneville, they found more than just a shallow grave. They found a young man wearing the dress blues of a United States Marine, a uniform that should have represented honor and service, now soaked in blood and dirt. The victim had been shotgunned and decapitated. This wasn't just murder, this was execution. Within days, the victim was identified as James T. Willett, just 26 years old, a former Marine from Los Angeles County. The news of his identity hit radio and television broadcasts on Friday, November 10, 1972. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn, because someone was watching those news reports very carefully, someone who knew exactly who James Willett was and why he had to die. Saturday, November 11th. Stockton, California police spot a station wagon parked outside 720 West Flora Street. It's James Willett's car, sitting there like a breadcrumb, leading investigators straight to the killer's door. When police try to enter the house, they're refused entry, so they break down the door. Inside, they find a scene that Vincent Buliosi would later describe as a window into the continuing nightmare of the Manson family. 2 men, 2 women, and an arsenal of weapons. But it's what they see on the women's faces that sends chills down their spines. Fresh X's carved into their foreheads, the calling card of Manson's most devoted followers. The women are Priscilla Cooper, 21, and Nancy Pittman, 20, a woman Charles Manson himself had once marked as his chief candidate for family assassin. Think about that for a moment. In a group known for its capacity for violence, Nancy Pittman stood out as the one Manson trusted most to kill. The men are Michael Monfort and James Craig, both prison escapees with AB tattooed on their chests. Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang involved in murder for hire. But the most chilling arrival comes just minutes after the arrests. A phone call to the house, a woman's voice asking to be picked up and given a ride. The police, thinking quickly, agree to help. And who walks into their trap? Lynette Squeaky Fromme, the woman who had taken control of the Manson family in Charlie's absence. As investigators search the house, they notice something disturbing in the basement. Freshly turned earth. Dirt that looks like it's been recently disturbed. After obtaining a search warrant, they begin to dig. And early Sunday morning, they make a discovery that reveals the true horror of what happened in that house. Lauren Willett, 19 years old, wife of James Willett, buried in the basement, shot once in the head. The coroner estimates she died late Friday night or early Saturday morning, just hours after her husband's identity was revealed on television. Let that sink in. Lauren Willett learned that her husband had been brutally murdered, and within hours, she was dead too. When questioned, Priscilla Cooper offers up a story that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. She claims Lauren killed herself playing Russian roulette. But unlike previous investigations that had given the Manson family the benefit of the doubt, the Stockton police weren't buying it. They charged all 5 suspects with murder. The legal proceedings that followed painted a picture of a crime that was as calculated as it was brutal. In April 1973, 4 of the 5 defendants shocked the court by entering guilty pleas. Michael Monfort confessed to murdering Lauren Willett and received 7 years to life. James Craig got consecutive sentences totaling 7 years for being an accessory to murder and weapons charges. Both Priscilla Cooper and Nancy Pittman, Manson's chosen assassin, were sentenced to 5 years for being accessories after the fact. But here's what's truly terrifying. Squeaky Fromme walked free. There wasn't enough evidence to tie her directly to Lauren's murder, so she was released to once again take control of the remaining Manson family members. The official motive? Police believed the Willets were killed because they knew too much about the armed robberies the group had been committing. James was going to talk, so they silenced him. Lauren was killed to keep her from going to the police about her husband's murder. James Willett and Lauren Willett. James and Lauren. James and Lauren. Something about those names seemed familiar to Vincent Buliosi. Then it came to him in a flash. November 27, 1970. Defense attorney Ronald Hughes disappears while camping at Sespe Hot Springs during the Manson trial. The man who had been representing Leslie Van Houten, who had dared to suggest that his client might want to separate her defense from Manson's, simply vanished. The couple who drove Hughes to the hot springs were questioned by police. Their names, James Forsher and Lauren Elder, both 17 years old. James and Lauren. James and Lauren. Now, here's where Buliosi's investigative mind starts connecting dots that most people would dismiss as coincidence. James and Lauren. James Willett was 26 in 1972, which would have made him 24 in 1970, not quite 17. But Lauren Willett was 19 in 1972, which means she would have been exactly 17 in 1970. Buliosi checked the police reports and newspaper articles, but was unable to find any description of Forsher and Elder. All other efforts to track them down were unsuccessful. Lauren is not a common name. The chances of two different Laurens being connected to both the disappearance of Ronald Hughes and the Manson family murders seemed astronomically small to a prosecutor who had learned never to believe in coincidences when it came to Charles Manson. When Hughes's body was finally found months later, the autopsy was inconclusive, badly decomposed, wedged under a rock in a pool of water. The official cause of death? Undetermined. But there was mention of medication residue in his stomach, something that could have been drugs or poison. Buliosi requested a full investigation into Hughes's death. The request was denied. No evidence of foul play, they said. Case closed. But the story doesn't end there, because while working on a documentary about the Manson family, filmmaker Lawrence Merrick gained the trust of the remaining family members. And what Sandra Good told him, off-camera and unrecorded, would validate every one of Buliosi's darkest suspicions. She admitted that the family had killed 35 to 40 people. Let me repeat that, 35 to 40 victims. The Tate LaBianca murders that shocked the world and sent Manson to prison? They were just the tip of the iceberg. And then Sandy Good revealed something that sent chills down the spine of everyone who heard it. Hughes, she said, was the first of the retaliation murders. The first. Which means Ronald Hughes, the defense attorney who dared to challenge Charles Manson in court, was murdered by the very people he was trying to defend. And his death was just the beginning of a killing spree designed to send a message to anyone who crossed the family. In 1977, that same filmmaker, Lawrence Merrick, was shot in the back of the head and killed in another murder that was linked to the Manson family. The murders of James and Lauren Willett represent more than just two more tragic deaths in the Manson family's bloody wake. They represent the continuation of a reign of terror that most people thought had ended with the Tate LaBianca convictions. But here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this case. If Sandra Good was telling the truth, if the family really killed 35 to 40 people, then how many other victims are still out there? How many other families never got closure? How many other crimes were dismissed as accidents or suicides when they were actually cold-blooded murder? Vincent Buliosi spent his career pursuing justice, but even he couldn't solve every mystery left in the Manson family's wake. The case of the Willets was closed with guilty pleas and prison sentences. the death of Ronald Hughes remains officially undetermined. When the gavel came down on March 29, 1971, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and soon after Charles Tex Watson received the ultimate punishment, death. For nearly a year, they sat on San Quentin's death row, isolated in their cells, waiting for California to execute them for the brutal murders of 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate and her unborn child. But fate had other plans. In February 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty, and just like that, their sentences were commuted to life in prison. Manson was furious. He'd actually wanted to die, seeing martyrdom as the final act in his twisted performance. Instead, he faced something far more mundane and perhaps more torturous: growing old behind bars. However, the decision caused widespread public and political backlash. In November 1972, just months after the ruling, California voters passed Proposition 17, amending the state constitution to explicitly allow the death penalty. This overturned the ruling and reinstated capital punishment in California. But prisoners on death row before the reversal didn't get their sentences reverted to the death penalty. Their penalties remained as life imprisonment. So the Manson family had cheated death. George Spahn lived for 5 years after the murders. For the first year, he still stayed on the ranch with some of the women of the Manson family until it was destroyed in a large wildfire in September 1970. He was eventually admitted to the Sherwood Convalescent Hospital in Van Nuys, where he died on September 22, 1974, at the age of 85. What the public didn't realize was that while the convicted killers were adjusting to life sentences, other family members on the outside were planning something that would thrust the Manson name back into headlines in the most shocking way possible. Prison officials knew keeping the family together would be a nightmare, so they scattered the convicted members across California's prison system. But dozens of other family members remained free, living in communes still devoted to Charlie's apocalyptic vision. Among them was Lynette "Squeaky Fromme, Manson's most devoted follower, who'd somehow avoided prosecution for the murders. Red-haired, childlike, and completely devoted to her imprisoned leader, Squeaky had become the de facto leader of the remaining family members. She lived in a rundown apartment in Sacramento with fellow family member Sandra, writing letters to Manson and waiting for his revolution to begin. The summer of 1975 started quietly enough. Manson had been transferred between prisons, the women were settling into their prison routines, and the public was beginning to forget about the family. Then came September 5th. President Gerald Ford was visiting Sacramento, and Squeaky Fromme saw an opportunity. Dressed in a flowing red robe, red for the redwood trees she claimed Manson wanted to save, she positioned herself in Capitol Park with a loaded Colt .45. Her plan, according to later testimony, wasn't necessarily to kill Ford, but to bring attention to environmental issues and, more importantly, to her imprisoned guru. I'll be back after this quick break. The gun didn't fire. Investigators later determined it had bullets in the magazine, but none in the chamber. Whether this was intentional or incompetence remains unclear. Fromme claimed she never intended to shoot, but the weapon was loaded and pointed at the president's abdomen from just 2 feet away. It didn't go off, she told arresting officers, but the damage was done. The Manson family was front-page news again, and this time they'd threatened the President of the United States. But the story doesn't end there. Just 17 days later, on September 22nd, another woman, Sarah Jane Moore, attempted to assassinate President Ford in San Francisco. While Moore wasn't connected to the Manson family, the back-to-back assassination attempts created a media frenzy about cult violence and domestic terrorism. Squeaky Fromme was sentenced to life in prison, becoming the first person prosecuted under a 1965 law making it a federal crime to threaten the president. She would spend the next 34 years behind bars, writing love letters to Manson and maintaining her devotion to his environmental and racial theories. 2 years after Fromme's assassination attempt, another bombshell rocked the Manson case. On December the 15th, 1977, acting on a tip from Steve Clem Grogan, police discovered the remains of Shorty Shea. Donald Shorty Shea had been a ranch hand at Spahn Ranch, the remote movie set where the Manson family had lived before the murders. Shea, a 35-year-old married man, had grown suspicious of the family's activities, and Manson suspected him of informing the police and instigating the police raid on Spahn Ranch. He disappeared in August 1969, a few days after Manson and his followers were released. For 8 years, his fate remained unknown. Manson family members had been convicted of his murder based on testimony from other family members, but without a body, questions lingered. Some wondered if Shea had simply fled, starting a new life somewhere else. Steve Grogan, the family member who'd confessed to participating in Shea's murder, drew a map that led authorities to the burial site as part of a plea agreement. His cooperation in solving the 8-year-old mystery became a key factor in his eventual parole. The discovery of his skeletal remains, buried in a shallow grave and showing signs of multiple stab wounds, confirmed the worst. Shea had been brutally murdered, likely tortured before his death. The discovery of Shorty Shea's remains opened floodgates of speculation about other Manson family victims. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, investigators received tips about additional murders, missing persons, and suspicious deaths connected to the family. In 1978, authorities announced they were investigating the family's possible connection to as many as 35 additional murders. The cases stretched from California to Texas, involving hitchhikers, runaways, and drug dealers who'd crossed paths with family members between 1967 and 1970. While most of these cases were never definitively solved, they created a growing awareness that the 7 confirmed Manson family victims might represent only a fraction of their true toll. While the outside world was grappling with assassination attempts and buried bodies, the convicted family members were undergoing their own transformations behind bars. Susan Atkins was the first to break from Manson's influence. By 1974, she'd found religion and began expressing genuine remorse for her crimes. She married Donald Leisure in 1981, a bizarre ceremony that made headlines when Leisure claimed to be a wealthy entrepreneur, which he wasn't. The marriage was later annulled, but Atkins remarried in 1987 to Harvard law student James Whitehouse. In 2008, it was announced that Susan Atkins had terminal brain cancer. Atkins died on September 24, 2009, at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Her husband, James Whitehouse, subsequently released a statement saying that her last whispered word was, "Amen." The cost for Atkins's medical care since she was hospitalized on March 18, 2008, reportedly surpassed $1.15 million, with additional costs of over $300,000 to guard her hospital room. Patricia Krenwinkel withdrew into herself, working prison jobs and slowly beginning to process what she'd done. Unlike Atkins, she didn't immediately embrace religion, but she pursued education and avoided the disciplinary problems that plagued other inmates. She remains in prison to this day, having served 55 years in prison. Leslie Van Houten, the youngest of the group, seemed to transform most completely. She earned her bachelor's degree, then a master's degree, and became a model prisoner who worked with other inmates and participated in rehabilitation programs. In 1977, Leslie Van Houten was granted a retrial due to the failure to declare a mistrial when Ronald Hughes, her lawyer, disappeared. Her defense argued that Van Houten's capacity for rational thought had been diminished due to LSD use and Manson's influence. The jury could not agree on a verdict. She was freed for 6 months before being found guilty of first-degree murder. Van Houten was given a life sentence that entailed eligibility for parole, for which the prosecutor said she would one day be suitable. After many failed parole attempts, Leslie Van Houten was released on parole on July 11, 2023, after serving 53 years in prison. According to reports, her net worth at the time of her release was $15 million, due to book deals and media appearances over the years. Court documents would reveal the value of Sharon Tate's estate at the time of her death was $45,400. That's the same as around $300,000 in today's money. Isn't that interesting? Tex Watson converted to Christianity in 1975. In 1979, he married Kristen Jones Sveig, and together they founded Abounding Love Ministries, Inc. in 1980. Through conjugal visits, they were able to have 4 children, 3 boys, 1 girl, but those visits for life prisoners were banned in October 1996. After 24 years of marriage, Sveig divorced Watson after meeting another man in 2003. Sveig and Watson remain friends. He had become an ordained minister in 1981 and received a BS in business management in 2009 from California Coast University, a distance learning college. In August 1982, a Southern California-based group, Citizens for Truth, submitted some 80,000 petition signatures and several thousand letters opposing Watson's parole. The group received support from Doris Tate, the mother of victim Sharon Tate. In later years, the group, with Doris Tate and her daughters Patricia and Deborah, submitted petitions with more than 2 million signatures. In 2012, Watson disputed a request to release recordings made in 1969 with his defense attorney, Bill Boyd. The recordings became part of a bankruptcy proceeding involving the deceased attorney's law firm. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department said they believed the recordings might contain clues about unsolved murder cases involving the Manson family. Watson asked the presiding judge to allow police to listen to the tapes but not take possession of them. Judge Richard A. Schell ruled Watson had waived attorney-client privilege for the tapes after he allowed the co-author of his 1978 memoir to hear the recordings. The LAPD acquired the tapes, which allegedly contained Watson confessing to other murders, but reportedly no new information. The tapes have never been made public. Watson remains in prison to this day and is unlikely to ever get released. Bobby Beausoleil is also currently still in prison, having served more than 55 years in jail. He is an accomplished musician and has released a number of albums, including movie soundtracks, which were recorded in prison. In September 2005, investigators launched their most extensive search yet for additional Manson family victims, focusing on Barker Ranch in Death Valley, the remote desert hideout where Manson and his followers were captured in 1969. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, the team searched for evidence of the additional murders that family members had hinted at over the years. The investigation was prompted by new statements from former family members and tips from the public about possible burial sites. The search lasted several days and generated intense media coverage, with news helicopters circling overhead as investigators carefully examined the desert landscape. They found several suspicious areas and potential burial sites, but no human remains. While the search was ultimately unsuccessful, it demonstrated law enforcement's ongoing belief that the Manson family's true victim count might never be known. Former prosecutor Stephen Kay estimated that the family could have been responsible for as many as 35 murders, most of which would never be solved. On August 14, 2009, after serving 34 years in federal prison, Lynette "Squeaky Fromme was released on parole. Her release was controversial. She'd never expressed remorse for attempting to assassinate President Ford and had maintained her devotion to Manson throughout her imprisonment. Fromme, 60 years old, was released to a halfway house in Texas, far from California and her former family associates. Parole conditions prohibited her from contacting Manson or other family members, and she was required to undergo regular psychological evaluations. Her release sparked debate about the rehabilitation of domestic terrorists and cult members. Unlike the Manson family murderers, who remained in prison despite evidence of transformation, Fromme was freed despite showing little evidence of changed beliefs. She lived quietly after her release, working odd jobs and maintaining a low profile. In rare interviews, she continued to defend Manson and express concern for environmental issues, though she avoided direct threats or inflammatory statements. 44 years after Shorty Shay's murder, The case finally reached a form of closure when Steve Grogan was officially discharged from parole. Grogan had been released from prison in 1985 after serving 14 years. His cooperation in locating Shay's body was a major factor in his parole. Grogan's release and successful reintegration into society became a talking point in debates about the other family members. He'd committed murder alongside the others, but his willingness to take responsibility and help solve the Shay case had earned him freedom. Why, supporters asked, shouldn't genuine rehabilitation and cooperation be rewarded for the others as well? Critics pointed out key differences. Grogan had been younger, less involved in the family's inner circle, and hadn't participated in the Tate LaBianca murders that had shocked the world. His case, they argued, was fundamentally different from the others. Bruce Davis was convicted for the murders of Hinman and Shay, a horse wrangler who lived on the Spahn Ranch with the Manson family. He was sentenced to life in prison. At one point, the FBI considered that Davis could have been the Zodiac killer, but he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Davis allegedly became a born-again Christian during his incarceration and helped former Manson member Atkins do the same. Davis has been denied parole dozens of times, and his most recent hearing in 2024 was postponed after he appeared on a true crime podcast. And before you ask, no, it wasn't this one. Linda Kasabian received immunity for her testimony against Manson and his followers. At trial, she told jurors that Manson's women did anything and everything for him. Kasabian had 2 children, one of whom was with her while she was in the Manson family. Later, she was unable to work after a car accident left her disabled. Kasabian died in January 2023 in Washington. She was 73. Mary Brunner was initially charged with Hinman's murder, but later received immunity as she testified against Beausoleil and Atkins. In 1971, Brunner assisted other members in robbing a gun store with the ultimate goal of hijacking a plane and breaking Manson out of prison. As a result, she received a sentence of 20 years to life, though she was released on parole in 1977. Brunner has stayed out of the public eye since her release and was last reported to be living in the Midwest. She had 1 son with Manson, Valentine Michael Manson, whom Brunner's parents reportedly raised. Ruth Ann Morehouse was not involved in any of the murders, but was part of a plot to kill Manson family member Barbara Hoyt. While on a trip to Hawaii, she allegedly fed Hoyt an acid-laced hamburger in an attempt to murder her before she was set to testify. Hoyt survived, and Morehouse was convicted of attempting to dissuade a witness in 1971. However, she fled before her sentencing. In 1975, Morehouse was found and arrested in Sacramento, California. A judge then declared her free to go, citing her rough upbringing. Morehouse was last reported to be living with her husband and 3 children in the Midwest. We'll find out what happened to Beach Boy Dennis Wilson after this quick break. The years following the Manson murders were particularly devastating for Dennis Wilson, who carried an enormous psychological burden from his connection to Charles Manson. Wilson bore a burden for having known Manson so soon before his violence, and according to bandmate Mike Love's memoir, Wilson told him in 1969, "I just saw Charlie take his M16 and blow this black guy in half and stuff him down the well," suggesting Wilson may have witnessed unreported murders that haunted him for the rest of his life. This psychological trauma, combined with his already existing tendency toward excess, sent Wilson into a destructive spiral of addiction and erratic behavior. Wilson's final years were marked by escalating substance abuse and financial ruin. Drug and alcohol abuse caused Dennis to quit and rejoin the band numerous times. His financial situation had become so dire that at the time of his death, Dennis Wilson's net worth was estimated to be around $10,000. Wilson's wealth diminished due to a turbulent personal life, heavy substance abuse, and financial mismanagement. Dennis Wilson's life came to a tragic end on December 28, 1983. He drowned while diving near his boat in Marina del Rey, California. At the time of his death, Dennis was only 39 years old. Following the traumatic events of the Manson murders, Terry Melcher faced a difficult period of adjustment and fear. At that time, Melcher was producing music by singer Jimmy Boyd for A&M Records. After initial tracks were recorded, the Manson murders occurred, reportedly prompting Melcher to go into seclusion, and the session was never completed. Despite the psychological trauma, Melcher eventually found the strength to return to his passion for music production. After the events surrounding the Manson family, Terry Melcher went back to his life as a normal music producer. He continued producing for the Byrds and even recording his own albums. Melcher continued to produce for various music artists while also dabbling in television production. One of Melcher's most notable later achievements came in the late 1980s when he co-wrote what would become one of the Beach Boys' biggest hits in decades. Melcher co-wrote the hit song Kokomo for the Beach Boys. The song was used in the movie Cocktail and was nominated for a Golden Globe in 1988 for Best Original Song. This success demonstrated that despite the dark shadow cast by the Manson connection, Melcher's creative talents remained sharp and commercially viable well into his later career. Terry Melcher passed away at his home in Beverly Hills on November 19, 2004, at the age of 62, after an extended battle with melanoma. He was survived by his wife Therese and son Ryan. The brutal murder of Sharon Tate and their unborn child in August 1969 devastated Roman Polanski, but in a characteristic display of artistic resilience, he channeled his trauma into his work. The extreme violence experienced by Polanski throughout his life was often reflected in his films, which tended to focus on the darker themes of alienation and evil. His first film after the tragedy was Macbeth. Polanski adapted Macbeth into a screenplay with the Shakespeare expert Kenneth Tynan. John Finch and Francesca Annis played the main characters. Hugh Hefner and Playboy Productions funded the 1971 film, a dark, violent interpretation of Shakespeare's bloodiest play that many critics saw as Polanski's way of processing his grief and rage. Polanski's career reached new heights in the mid-1970s with Chinatown, widely regarded as one of the greatest films of the decade and a masterpiece of neo-noir cinema. The film's themes of corruption, betrayal, and the vulnerability of innocence seem to reflect the director's own traumatic experiences. However, his professional success was overshadowed by personal scandal when on the 11th of March 1977, 3 years after making Chinatown, Polanski was arrested at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel for the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl, charged with 6 offenses against Samantha Gailey: unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, rape by use of drugs, perversion, sodomy, a lewd and lascivious act upon a child. The legal case that followed would define the remainder of Polanski's life and career. He reached an agreement with prosecutors that he would plead guilty to a lesser charge of unlawful sexual intercourse and would not have to go to prison beyond the jail time he had already served. However, a judge privately told lawyers he would renege on a promise and imprison Polanski. Fearing a lengthy prison sentence, he fled to France the following year. After serving 42 days in jail, an international arrest warrant was issued by the U.S. authorities, but he has never returned to face justice. Since 1978, Polanski has lived in exile in Europe, primarily in France and Poland, continuing to make films while remaining a fugitive from American justice. Despite his legal troubles, he has continued to receive recognition in international film circles, though his reputation remains forever tainted by both the tragedy that befell his wife and his own criminal actions. In press notes for his 2019 film J'accuse at the Venice Film Festival, Polanski, 86, said he felt his image was affected negatively after the murder of his then-wife Tate, though critics argue it was his own criminal behavior, not the murder of his wife, that damaged his reputation. Now in his 90s, Polanski remains a controversial figure, a talented filmmaker whose artistic legacy will always be overshadowed by his status as a convicted sex offender and fugitive from justice. Following his stunning courtroom victory in the Manson case, Vincent Buliosi transformed from a successful prosecutor into one of America's most prominent true crime authors. His first and most famous book, Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders, co-written with Kurt Gentry and published in 1974, became a cultural phenomenon. The book won the Edgar Award in 1975 for Best Fact Crime Book and became one of the best-selling true crime books of all time, establishing Buliosi as a master of the genre and ensuring his place in legal and literary history. Buliosi's success with Helter Skelter launched a prolific writing career that would span 4 decades. He would write 11 more books after that, but Buliosi would always be best remembered as the man who put Manson and his followers away. His subsequent works tackled some of the most controversial and high-profile cases in American history. He wrote extensively about the O.J. Simpson trial in Outrage, The 5 Reasons Why O.J. Simpson Got Away with Murder, where Buliosi argues that Simpson was guilty. He criticizes the work of the district attorney, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and Judge Lance Ito. True to his prosecutorial nature, Buliosi didn't hesitate to critique what he saw as failures in the justice system. Perhaps his most ambitious work came later in his career with Reclaiming History, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a massive tome that took him 20 years to research and write. Buliosi based much of the book on his preparation for a mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald staged by British television, in which he acted as the prosecutor of Oswald. The mock trial involved an actual U.S. judge and U.S. citizens acting as jurors, and Oswald was defended by prominent trial lawyer Jerry Spence. The book represented Buliosi's methodical approach to debunking conspiracy theories and his unwavering belief in the power of evidence and logical argument. Buliosi died of cancer at age 80 at a Los Angeles hospital on June 6, 2015. He is interred in the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His death marked the end of a remarkable career that had transformed him from a determined young prosecutor into a literary figure whose meticulous approach to investigating and presenting complex criminal cases influenced both the legal profession and popular culture's understanding of true crime. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died at Kern County Hospital after being transported from Corcoran State Prison. He was 83 years old and had spent 46 years behind bars, nearly half a century paying for his role in orchestrating some of America's most shocking murders. Manson's death was less dramatic than his life. He'd been hospitalized multiple times in his final years, suffering from various ailments related to age and long-term incarceration. His last interview, conducted months before his death, showed a confused, rambling old man who could barely complete coherent sentences. His death sparked surprisingly little public reaction. The world had moved on from Charles Manson, relegating him to historical footnote status. There were no crowds of mourners, no public memorial, no final dramatic statements. He was cremated, his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. For the surviving family members still in prison, Manson's death marked the end of an era. The man who'd controlled their lives, even from behind bars, was gone. Whatever hold he'd maintained over their psyches through decades of imprisonment was finally broken. Regular Crime Time, Inc. listeners will know that our co-host Tom Wood loves connections. So we are going to finish episode 30 and the last of our Charles Manson series with another incredible connection. 2019 saw the release of the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. One of the most haunting aspects of the Quentin Tarantino movie isn't just how it reimagines the Manson murders, but how it captures a truth that most viewers probably didn't realize was historically accurate. In the film, Brad Pitt's character Cliff Booth visits the aging, nearly blind George Spahn at his ranch to check on his old friend and employer. It's a tense scene that perfectly captures the eerie atmosphere of the ranch in 1969. With its decaying movie sets and the ominous presence of the Manson family members who had taken up residence there. What makes this scene particularly powerful is that it wasn't just Hollywood fiction. According to Dawn Moore, daughter of Clayton Moore, the actor who played the Lone Ranger, this exact scenario actually happened to her and her father in June 1969, just 2 months before the murders. In a revealing 2022 interview, she described how her father, visiting a friend from out of town, decided to stop by Spahn Ranch to say hello to George Spahn, whom he hadn't seen in 8 or 9 years from their days filming together. The real-life encounter was remarkably similar to Tarantino's fictional version. Dawn, then 11 years old and dressed in a go-go outfit with orange polka dots, accompanied her father and his friend in a Volkswagen bus to what she described as looking like a ghost town, like a Western ghost town, with mangy dogs running around and half-dead horses. When they arrived, young hippies emerged and gave them pushback when Clayton asked to see George, with one telling them, "He's kind of not available right now." But Clayton Moore, like Brad Pitt's character, wasn't taking no for an answer. The most chilling parallel comes in the darkened trailer scene. Dawn recalled how her father walked into George's completely dark trailer and announced himself, "Hi, George, it's Clayton." The nearly blind rancher responded, "Clayton, is that you?" and began to cry. You probably didn't notice. Or if you did, you probably didn't realize the significance of a photograph visible on the wall in the movie. It's of Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger, with Jay Silverheels as Tonto, a direct tribute to the real encounter that inspired the scene. Dawn remembered the smell of old people and how dirty and dark everything was, wanting desperately to leave while her father stayed for about an hour talking with George. Clayton assessed that while George was lonely and not entirely comfortable, he wasn't in imminent danger and everything seemed under control. Of course, just 2 months later, the Moore family would learn along with the rest of the world that those hippies who had given them pushback, specifically Squeaky Fromme, who was in charge of caring for George, were members of the Manson family. This parallel between fiction and reality adds another disturbing layer to the Manson story. The fact that both the fictional Cliff Booth and the real Clayton Moore visited George Spahn under nearly identical circumstances highlights how the ranch had become a nexus where Hollywood's golden age collided with something much darker. It wasn't just a place where Manson happened to end up, it was a location deeply embedded in the entertainment industry, with connections to actors, stuntmen, and the broader Hollywood community that extended far beyond what most people realized. When Dawn Moore first saw the scene in the theater, she was a little freaked out to see something that had only ever lived in her own memory on the screen happening, and it really happened almost verbatim. The scene works so powerfully because it captures the genuine unease that people who knew the ranch in its heyday felt when they witnessed what it had become. For younger listeners like Simon, who might not be familiar with the Lone Ranger, imagine if Batman had existed in the Old West instead of Gotham City. The Lone Ranger was essentially America's first masked superhero, debuting on radio in 1933 and later becoming a hugely popular television series that ran from 1949 to 1957. The character was a Texas Ranger who was the sole survivor of an ambush by outlaws. Nursed back to health by a Native American named Tonto, he donned a black mask made from his dead brother's vest and dedicated his life to fighting injustice in the American frontier. He rode a white horse named Silver, used silver bullets as his calling card, and always left with his famous cry of, "Hi-yo, Silver away!" His moral code was absolute. He never killed anyone, always gave criminals a chance to surrender, and fought for justice without seeking personal gain or glory. In the 1950s, when television was still new and most American families gathered around a single TV set, the Lone Ranger was appointment viewing. Children across the country would rush home to watch Clayton Moore gallop across the screen, fighting bad guys and protecting innocent people. The show's popularity was enormous. It spawned lunchboxes, toys, costumes, and countless imitations. The Lone Ranger wasn't just entertainment. He was a moral compass for an entire generation of American children, teaching lessons about right and wrong, courage, and standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. The Lone Ranger, that symbol of American justice and heroism, had found himself face to face with the reality of what the ranch had become under Manson's influence. A moment that perfectly encapsulates the broader Manson story about how the seemingly innocent worlds of 1960s counterculture and Hollywood glamour concealed much darker currents beneath the surface. And so we come to the last analysis of this series from our own Lone Ranger and Tonto after this quick break.
Well, Simon, episode 30, and I think in fairness we've got to take our hat off to Alex, because what he's created here is a masterpiece. I mean, you and I are both keen on detail, but I've never, ever heard a detailed investigation or re-investigation like this. And you know, we're actually not finished yet, because the more we speak about this and the more you look at it, the more things come out of the woodwork. Absolutely incredible. In episode 30, the case of the murders of James Willett and Lauren Willett really grabbed me. And one or two things came to me. James Willett, he's an ex-Marine. He's found buried in a shallow grave. And now he's an ex-Marine, okay? And he's wearing his Marine blues, his dress Marine uniform. What is that about? How why was he wearing his Marine uniform? Was he wearing it when he was killed, or did they dress him like that when they buried him as some kind of honourable thing?
And then we find out that Lauren Willett, his wife, was killed within hours of that.
I know, and scant efforts to dispose of her body. She's just buried in the basement.
Buried down the stairs, put her down the stairs.
That's right.
Tom, I need to ask you, because you were very sceptical about the finding of Ronald Hughes' body. And anyone that's following this episode will know what I'm talking about. This was Leslie Van Houten's lawyer, who dared suggest that she split from the Manson camp and have her own defence. And you were quite happy that it was misadventure, if you like. He was out walking. Have you having second thoughts about that now?
No, on balance, no. Now, had he been found dead in the LA area or buried outside on the desert or something like that, yes, I would have been. But the truth is, what we know about that case was he was up in the wilds. The weather was so inhospitable that the people he was with quit and left, and he stayed. He was behaving oddly. I don't know whether the pressure of the case got to him.
Yeah. He's got the papers with him.
Well, that's right. He had a lot of the case papers with him. And then he's found lying dead in the stream pretty close to where he was last seen.
Tom, something that struck me about it was Buliosi, who we now know is very astute, and there's nobody more switched on to the nuances of the Manson case and family activities than Buliosi. He wanted an inquiry into the death of Ronald Hughes, and it was refused. He wanted an inquiry, so there must have been something that he was thinking that could be found, because the cause of death was inconclusive. There was no evidence of foul play. But once that's been said, it's very difficult to retract and go back. Who refused him an inquiry? Can the police ever refuse to carry out something that the prosecution want done?
I think, remember that I get the impression, it's only an impression, that by this stage, Buliosi is seeing shadows everywhere. And why would he not? Given what he has been through and he has experienced. The authorities must have been getting absolutely sick and tired of this whole thing. They must have wanted to move on and put it behind them. Politically and socially, it was a huge embarrassment to the state of California. What's happening, and it was seen as a breakdown of society. The other thing is that Hughes, his body was found sometimes later in a state of advanced decomposition. You and I both know that tests and traces from bodies in that state that have been lying outdoors for many, many months.
I think he may have been in the water as well.
He was lying in a stream in the water.
Nothing worse.
The only thing that would have been worse would have been salt water. That's the only thing that would have been worse.
Yeah.
Fresh water comes pretty close. So I think probably they looked at it in balance and just thought misadventure. So look, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. On balance, I still think it was an accidental death. But in this case, you'd be a fool if you put your pension on it.
I was interested in this character, Sandy Good. You see, this is why we need to follow up on this, Tom. We've got 30 episodes here, and it's a fantastic piece of work in its own right. But there's so many characters involved here. We could write a book about these characters on their own. And Sandy Good falls into that category a bit too. And she says that of the 35 to 40 victims, Tom, Hughes was the first retaliation murder. She had no benefit in lying at that point.
How often have you been involved in a case where you're looking at somebody for 3 or 4 murders, and then you'll see a tabloid headline, believed to have killed 50. The reality is you've got to follow the evidence, and you've got to try and fill in the gaps. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. But these are not, the thing is, Simon, let's be honest, they're not clever killers.
No.
They're not artful. They're not clever. They don't cover their tracks. They've been aided and abetted by the incompetence of the police departments around about there. So, I'm a bit sceptical.
Yeah. Because there's nothing in any of the murders that we know they were convicted of and we know that they were involved in. They're not, as you say, they're just blatant. And they could have been caught a lot sooner, as we know, as we've discussed over the 30 episodes, if things had been different, if the systems had been in place to do that.
Well, listen, they could have been caught on the night by the highway patrol, let's be honest. I mean, they were so inept. The one character who comes out from this with questions for me is Squeaky Fromme. This wee girl, wee angelic wee face she's got, and she eventually turns up to try and kill Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, she's in charge at Spawn Ranch. She's Manson's first lieutenant, really.
Very much so.
And of course,
because she was looking after the old guy at the ranch. She was keeping him happy the whole time, wasn't she?
She was taken care of in every way. George Spawn, old George Spawn. Yeah, that's right. I think she's been involved in an awful lot more, and she's one of the driving forces behind it. I mean, look, there's no doubt Charlie Manson has dictated the whole terms of it, but you and I both know that you actually need somebody who's actually going to do it. Now, Tex Watson on the night, he's a cold-hearted killer.
Yeah.
But I think Squeaky Fromme, I think she flatters to deceive. I think she's been involved in a lot more. In terms of the planning, in terms of the intent, the guilty intent, I think Squeaky Fromme is a real piece of kit.
We'll have a look at some of them, like Squeaky. I'll just tell you just now, Squeaky was released 60 years of age. She was released in 2009, and she's kept a low profile since then, thought to be living in Texas. Alec has done his homework, and he gives us a lowdown on just about all the main characters here. But I know that being the final episode, you'll have some summing up to do of some major points that you want to discuss from what we've learned about this case over this, because that's the important bit. You always bring us back to that. Is the really important thing is, what did we learn? What did we put in place afterwards to minimise the chances of these things happening again?
Yeah, I think Alex has done a super job, and I like very much to find out what happened to these people. Tex Watson still in jail, an ordained minister, and he's managed to get
4 kids,
to have married and have children while he's in jail. She's a clever trick. Bobby Bosley in jail. Squeaky Fromme just got out, as you know. So isn't it interesting? They're still there and they're still in prison all these many years later. Yeah, I think there are 4 points really which struck me as being significant. One, the power of the cult. That the authorities, apart from probably Buliosi, didn't actually grip or understand just how powerful that cult was and how far the power extended. That was never really appreciated. And had it been appreciated, had it really been, I mean, we know how important they are and how powerful they are. And how
religious
they can,
cults. And
religious cults. And how they can drive people to commit suicide. So that's one thing. It's an extreme cult. And we'd be stupid to think that could not happen again.
Yeah.
Because there are various parts of the world, including the United States, where there are these cults, religious type based cults, which are all powerful. So the power of the cult. The second thing I've already mentioned was this remarkable lack from law enforcement, who never saw, and from what I can gather, never really looked for a big picture.
No.
And furthermore, they did not have systems to deal with it had they done so. Now, okay, we're talking about a long time ago, before computerized systems, etc., etc. I get all that. But even so, it was a long, long time before any kind of task force was ever brought together and where they
Yeah.
actually started to look at this in the round. I mean,
Yeah.
it was quite late on in the investigation. The Los Angeles County Sheriff and the Los Angeles Police Department were not really speaking to each other, and yet they were dealing with the same series of crimes.
Yes.
I think the other remarkable thing about this was this clash of crime and show business, which was just so happened to be there in Los Angeles at that time. And I can't think of another case, or certainly any case I was involved in, where you had that tremendous clash of crime, murder, and celebrity.
Yeah.
I suppose the Lord Lucan case in England, the murder way back in London, and of course that too spawned tremendous conspiracy theories, some of which are still going. The last point I would like to make is that, with the notable and honourable exception of Buliosi, the trial was a circus. The trial judge, in my view, did not handle the case well. He aided and abetted this circus, which it became. Well, I have to say, I think they were very, very lucky at the end of the day to secure convictions, because the whole thing was just bent completely out of shape.
I think those convictions in every part of what you've highlighted there is the overreaching parts of this case that stand out. The way the accused conducted themselves in the court, they convicted themselves. I don't think they would have been convicted if the court had been run properly. Or if the court had been run properly, they would have been forced to watch their own trial from prison if the judge had been doing his job properly. And I think justice would have been served just as easily that way without all the fiasco we had.
You might be right, Simon. I don't know, but you could very well be right. You could very well be right in saying that the actual circus, the debacle, which the trial ended up actually at the end of the day aided in their conviction. I have to say, I felt, as the thing went on, I felt more and more sorry for the jury. I mean, how they managed to keep themselves together and hold concentration in all of that. And the objectionable behaviour of Canarak and these sort of people, I just don't know. Yeah, so you might be right. The last thing, though, is we wrap up. I think it's important to say that as we've been talking about this and going through these episodes, so more information still comes in. And I think probably what we'll do is later on in the autumn, we could very well be revisiting Charlie Manson. Because of all the offshoots. But I'd just want to wind up on one thing, and I think it was wonderful, and that is the connection between Manson, Spawn Ranch, and the Lone Ranger.
I knew that would tickle you, Tom, because you remember that. I'm too young to remember.
I know, you're right, Simon. Yeah. Listen, it's time for truth. It's time to tell the truth, Simon. You're not too young to remember the Lone Ranger.
I remember going to the cinema with my big brother when we would be, I don't know, I'd be 6 or 7. The cinema in those days was a riot, Tom. I don't know. You were in Edinburgh, of course. You probably all sat nicely eating your sweetie. But ours was a riot. Whenever there was any dialogue on the screen, and this was in the days of Laurel and Hardy, I think you got 2 or 3 short films, and I think you got 2 feature films as well. We were in there for hours on end. Right. But every time there was any dialogue on the screen, everybody started chasing each other and fighting and carrying on. It was only in the action scenes that anybody sat and watched. One of the big ones all the time was The Lone Ranger. Fantastic.
Oh, it was wonderful. He was here. Yeah, I went to the same cinemas, and it was the ABC cinemas used to do it, and they had a Saturday club, and you had to go there. And at that time, you used to get these enormous big iced jubblies. Do you remember the jubbly? Yeah, jubbly. And you would suck all the juice out of it, and then you'd lob the ice ball over the balcony. But the Lone Ranger is interesting. Even then, I thought it was highly unlikely, because he wore a sort of a pale blue single-piece suit, a bit like that disco suit that I've seen you wearing, but not with the moth holes that you've got. But, and I always thought to myself, what do you mean an unlikely thing to be wearing?
No.
But it reminded me...
Platforms on right enough. I wear my platforms to go with it.
It reminded me of a great story, not to do with the Lone Rangers, but to do with Roy Rogers.
Talking.
Roy Rogers. These guys were the original men in the white hats. Yeah? Mm-hmm. They were the original goodies. I only learned Much to my disgrace, I've got to say. I only learned that the Lone Ranger made his black mask out of his brother's vest. I mean, first of all, it's a very unhygienic thing to do. But anyway, coming back to Roy Rogers, this is a true story. This is absolutely amazing. Roy Rogers and his wife, Dale Evans, okay, and they were a sort of singing duo, the singing cowboy. They came to Edinburgh in the mid-1950s, long before my time, and they brought with them their famous horse called Trigger. Now, Trigger was a huge, handsome Palomino stallion. He was a big, one of these beautiful ones with big long mane. And of course, they were circus horses, basically. And Trigger visited various places and climbed up the stairs in hotels in Edinburgh and all the rest of it. But when Roy Rogers was here, he became friendly with the chief constable of the Lothians and Peebles at that time, a man called Willie Merrilees. Merrilees is a famous character, first sort of self-publicist chief constable, Willie Merrilees. And Merrilees became friendly with Roy Rogers, and Merrilees was attracted to the stars. He was a friend with Walt Disney and all the rest of it. So Willie Merrilees. Now, Dale Evans ran in Montana. She ran an orphanage, and Willie Merrilees. Willie Merrilees thought it would be a good idea. Why don't you take back a Scottish girl? Now, can you imagine, Simon? Can you imagine it? I'll get you a Scottish girl, and so he did. And there was a wee 8-year-old girl from a home in Leith, an orphan wee girl, was sent away on the plane back home to Montana with Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. I mean, child protection? What? And the story ended well because the girl prospered when she was in America. And I have some documentary, because I inherited a lot of Willie Merrilees' papers when he died. I have a letter which she sent. She was grown up and she was a married woman. She had a family and had a very happy life. It was all because of Roy Rogers and Dale Evans' visit to Edinburgh. The other thing I have is a knife, a Bowie knife, which was given by Roy Rogers to Willie Merrilees. And I've often thought about that story and thought, because we think times don't change very much, but some things change. Can you imagine now saying, I'll take a wee, when I'm here, have you got any girls? I'll take them.
You used to have a cupboard in your office when you get promoted to deputy chief, and that's where you had all the secrets hidden. Now your house is full of them by the sounds of it. You've got papers. I mean, the Ruxton trial, the Ruxton book came from papers that you found or were handed into the office. You're a hoarder. That's what we call them through here.
That's right. And also the story about the German spies, the Expendables, that actually came via Willie Merrilees' papers.
Right.
The thing about it is, Simon, there is a treasure trove of stories and interesting things in these old papers, but you know what? You've actually got to read them. Oh. And most people don't.
Yeah, that's true.
Our libraries and our filing systems are full of these things, and actually very few people read the stories and take the stories out of them. And funnily enough, I'm going to be publishing a book of short stories.
I knew this was reading somewhere, Tom.
Hopefully later.
Put money on this coming up.
Later on this year, I'll be publishing a book of short stories, including all of the above.
I think I just inspired that. I think I should be some kind of commission involved here.
Listen,
Tom, my favourite TV programme back in the day, you won't remember, you'd be too old for this probably by the time I was watching it when I was a youngster. And it was nothing to do with the police or detectives or anything, you won't be surprised to hear. He was a train driver and his name was Casey Jones. And I could sing you the whole theme tune right now.
Go on, listen, I'll tell you what, thanks to Alec for your fantastic work. Thanks to everyone who's contributed this wonderful
sing you out.
And Simon's going to sing you out with Casey Jones, a steaming and a rolling.
You were talking about reading the papers. I only discovered when I was a teenager that Casey Jones was a real person. His name was John Luther Jones, Casey Jones. He was killed in a train accident. But the story was that he was going round a bend or something and there was a parked train in his way. It stalled in front of him. And everybody jumped off. He told his fireman to jump, but he didn't. He stayed with his hand on the brake. until the crash, and that was the end of Casey Jones. That's what inspired the programme, Casey Jones.
Yeah.
Stephen Allen wrote
And I tell you what, Simon, you can either sing Casey Jones or The Runaway Train. You'll be familiar with that as well.
Yeah. Tom, see, when you're as good a singer as me, you don't sing unless it's for money. I remember I was working in the prison on some job, and the boxer, Gary Jacobs, was in the prison. He was talking to some worthies, and they knew who he was, and said, "You think you could take me, big man? You think me and you could have a square go?" And Gary said, "Listen, there's no danger that's going to happen, because I only punch for money, mate."
You're not going to sing. And
No.
Simon, it's probably for the best. For the
Yes.
best.
I can
This
vouch for that.
self-delusion. Just a final postscript is to say that we talked about the case of D.B. Cooper, and D.B. Cooper is season 3, episode 53. Okay?
Well remembered. Tom, a final homage to Alec. He's done a fantastic job here, hasn't he? Over 30 episodes. I can't fault it at all. And I'm sure that he'll be involved in the follow-up that we do. Remember, there's inquiries ongoing into 35 cases as we leave it here today. 35 alleged murders, 35 to 40 murders that the family were involved in. The only seems to have been a spurious search of Spawn Ranch for a couple of days. I think there's lots more to be revealed here, but we'll do that in the autumn when we come back from our sabbatical.
We will. Just a little bit of good news for you, Simon. I had temporarily misplaced my true crime quiz book, but I found it. I found it. And so
that's good news
when
for me.
It's good news. It's good news for everyone. And when we come back, I'll be posing some other difficult questions. So remember to do your homework.
I'm going to be doing a bit of analysis of our audience, the Crime Time Inc. audience out there globally. A lot of new American listeners in the last few months. Maybe that's to do with Charles Manson. We're always looking for feedback via the website, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. We're very contactable. One of the things I'm going to be researching is whether the figures drop significantly when your true crime book comes out, because I suspect that's the case.
Best wishes, and thanks again to Alex. We'll see you next season.
Fantastic. Can't wait.
I hope you enjoyed our series on Charles Manson, the family, and the murders. This series is based on what can be described as the official narrative. The Manson story, as most people know, is based on the best true crime book of all time, Helter Skelter by Vincent Buliosi and Kurt Gentry. The book made Buliosi very famous and very rich. Let's get one thing straight. Yes, Manson family members did the killings, and yes, they were following instructions from Charles Manson. But was someone else instructing Charles Manson? In 1999, journalist Tom O'Neill was asked to write a magazine article about the Manson murders for the 30th anniversary of the killings. A straightforward assignment, he thought. He thought wrong. What followed was a 20-year investigation, which resulted in his 2019 book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, which was co-authored by Dan Piepenbring. The book reveals so many holes in Helter Skelter that it becomes hard to believe much of what Buliosi says in his book. Ironically, the dismantling of Buliosi's book began with a clue from Buliosi himself. After interviewing Buliosi for many hours one day, O'Neill asked Buliosi if he could share anything that had never been made public before. After a long pause, Buliosi asked O'Neill to switch off the recorder. Buliosi then told O'Neill about the videotape found by police at Cielo Drive after the Tate murders. According to Buliosi, on the tape was a video of Sharon Tate being forced to have sex with 2 men, while Roman Polanski filmed it. The tape was returned to the loft where it was found and never booked into evidence. Buliosi told O'Neill that he told detectives to return the tape because Roman has suffered enough. So let's pause there for a moment. If this was true, wasn't this rape? Doesn't that raise Polanski's profile as a suspect? But if you have really been paying attention, you will recall that Buliosi's version of events at the time was that he wasn't asked to become involved in the case until November 1969. So how could he have instructed detectives to return the tape 3 months earlier, only a few days after the murders? This is the first of many anomalies that were uncovered by Tom O'Neill, and this is what we will be looking at in future episodes of Crime Time Inc. Why was Charles Manson never held accountable for repeated parole violations? Despite multiple arrests for serious crimes over 2.5 years, Manson faced no consequences, even after being caught with stolen cars, weapons, and underage girls. What was the real relationship between Manson and his unusually lenient parole officer? Roger Smith, a UC Berkeley researcher, reduced his caseload from 40 parolees to just one, Manson, and even took temporary custody of Manson's child. Why was Manson's complete parole file never released? Why was Dennis Wilson never called to give evidence at any of the trials? Did key witness Terry Melcher commit perjury? Why was Vincent Buliosi's co-author, Kurt Gentry, present at the trials? Did Buliosi know he was going to write a book before the trials even started? Why was Dean Morehouse, father of key Manson family member Ruth Ann Morehouse, living at Terry Melcher's Cielo Drive house for months just before Tate and Polanski moved in? What other evidence is gathering dust in Los Angeles filing cabinets, and what exactly is on the tape recordings of Tex Watson that the authorities don't want the public to know about? Hopefully my contract with Crime Time Inc. will be renewed, and I'll be back soon. If you've enjoyed this series on Charles Manson, it would really help me if you would leave a positive review on whatever podcast platform you are using. Thanks.